This episode is brought to you by Google Gemini. With the Gemini app, you can talk live and have a real-time conversation with an AI assistant. It's great for all kinds of things, like if you want to practice for an upcoming interview, ask for advice on things to do in a new city, or brainstorm creative ideas. And by the way, this script was actually read by Gemini. Download the Gemini app for iOS and Android today. Must be 18 plus to use Gemini Live.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. One of the perks about having 4 kids that you know about is actually getting a direct line to the big man up north. And this year, he wants you to know the best gift that you can give someone is the gift of Mint Mobile's unlimited wireless for $15 a month. Now, you don't even need to wrap it. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Hello, hello. Welcome back to Peak Northwest, an outdoors and travel podcast by the Oregonian and Oregon Live, dedicated to the adventure and exploration of our beautiful Pacific Northwest. I'm Jamie Hale.
And I'm Vicki Connor. Together, we take you to some of the most beautiful and interesting destinations in our region, discussing where to go, what to do, and places to see. And today, we're going to be exploring the beautiful forests here in the Pacific Northwest.
Gosh, Vicki, I love the forest. I love being out there in these Northwest forests. There's something about them. There's something about the smell. There's something about the dampness, about all of the rich diversity of plants and wildlife. Something about just like walking through a forest, like on a misty morning in the fall or the spring, any season, just like being in that space is so lovely, so wonderful.
There's nothing like forest bathing and then just slowly looking up, as your eyes trace the trees and just like taking it all in right there.
Just like sitting on the damp earth and just like putting my hands like into the soil and like leaning back up against a tree and looking up at the canopy. You know what I mean?
Man, a true love letter.
Boy. Well, we have a lot to talk about here today about forests, but we have a special guest on the podcast today who is here to tell us a little bit more about our Pacific Northwest rainforests. We have Ross Reid, who is a filmmaker and environmentalist who is best known on social media as Nerdy About Nature. Ross, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be here. Gosh, you guys' little introduction there made me so... I just closed my eyes for a second and was picturing myself on that lush, damp forest floor leaning up against the bark of an old Doug fir. Beautiful.
Nothing like it. Well,
there really isn't.
We're used to seeing you out there on social media in the videos where you are in the forest usually, or in a lake, or by the ocean, or wherever, telling us some kind of very cool and interesting nature fact. How did you get started doing those videos?
Well, I mean, it honestly all kind of started as a bit of a joke. I have always been very into the outdoors. I was raised, skiing and climbing and hiking and biking and doing all the things on traditional Puyallup Nation land in present-day Tacoma, Washington, or outside of there, kind of the foothills there, and on Cowlitz territory, all sorts of stuff around the Pacific Northwest. So I was always just in love with the outdoors, and I got into filmmaking and doing outdoor sports stuff. But then on the side, I was always just kind of reading about the ecology and the biology of the places I was visiting and traveling to and spending time in. And then literally in 2019, I was dating a girl, and she was just, we would go on hikes, and I would just start ranting about this incredible western red cedar, and like, oh my God, look at the way that the trunk curls in this reiterated branch. And she's just like, oh my God, you're driving me insane. Like, you need to start an Instagram account or some way to channel this kind of obsessive behavior. So I did, as a total joke, in 2019, December. And then obviously the pandemic happened. And here in Canada, we had a really great support program from the government. So all my film work dried up, and I was getting basically paid by the government to hang out and make goofy nature videos. And then it all kind of spiraled with some political happenings around protecting old growth up here. And it's just been a great shift into kind of a new realm where I'm getting to like use my communication skills that I've gathered over the past few decades, combined with a bunch of just fun facts that I've accumulated over the years and schooling in biology and whatnot, to be able to educate people. Because I think that's where we can really begin to see change in the world, is when you start connecting people to the world around them, just by getting them to understand, processes of how or why this tree on this hill slope is important and what species it is. And, as soon as people connect to the lands and understand it more, then they have a greater connection to it, they fall in love with it, and thus are inclined to act in ways that protect it. So I really see myself as kind of working, just not kind of public education sphere, trying to get people out onto the lands and enjoying it and loving it and protecting it for future generations.
I love that. And I think it's really cool, Ross, that like you're not just sitting here like telling fun facts about, hey, did you know this? But like you can hear the passion in your voice, well, like when you start talking about this stuff, and it just comes across so clearly how much you care. Where have you learned all of this information about the natural world?
I mean, so I went to school in Montana State for biology. I minored in biology. I never ended up pursuing it because math is horribly triggering for me because of elementary and high school experiences that I don't need to get into. So I never pursued that. But it, and then I've gotten an MBA and undergrad in film production. So I'm familiar with schooling. So I know how to study, and I just kind of took that mentality of like studying and learning things to things that I was actually interested in. So it's mostly books. I'm still a fan of like an old, classic soft cover, flipping pages through. There's also sort of research on the internet, so I'm up to date with like any new papers and things that come out. Like I will vigorously read those, although I admit it is tiring being on screens. I wish I could highlight things a little easier. But yeah, it's mostly just like papers that come out and books and research articles and summaries of things. Like I just kind of get it from a wide range of topics, and I think it's just kind of having that endless like curiosity. I think it's a real trait that isn't very common these days, just kind of staying endlessly curious and understanding that as much as I will ever learn, I will never know everything. We will never know everything. We're always learning more, and staying curious about the world is a great mentality to have moving into it, moving through it.
That's one of the things I love about your social media videos is like, I mean, when you think about people who do, for lack of a better word, who are influencers in this way, I mean, it's not like you're like 5 weird facts about Northwest forests. It's like, the nuances of foliar uptake is a recent one, diversity of soil communities and why it's important. You did one in a lake. We were talking about how this cedar shavings from logging have affected like the lake bottom in such a way that like is not conducive for salmon habitat. And I was like, I never even thought about that.
Waters. Yeah.
Yeah. Like that's so interesting. There's all these different facts, and that they're all specific to like, the Pacific Northwest. As someone who loves it here and lives here and travels the area, like it's so interesting to see. Like I can look at a lake now in the forest and be like, I wonder what else is happening here. Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, not to correct you on that, but it's an estuary, so that's actually the sound. That's like where the salmon would outmigrate. But yeah, old impacts of logging, like all the stuff that you mentioned, like there's so many nuances to this, and it's almost unfortunate that in this broader scheme of internet communications, I'm lumped into an influencer, quote unquote, because God, I loathe that term. It's so offensive in a way. It's people, because and we don't need to get rambling on this too often, but like, a lot of people seeking to become influencers and looking for kind of fame on the internet do it in this like really kitschy sort of way, just like selling products and things that are made poorly that like people don't need. And it's just kind of appealing to this consumer capitalist mindset that ultimately has roots in like environmental degradation and destruction, like somewhere around the world. And it's just so inauthentic. So I really strive, on the fact that I don't do promotions and stuff like that. I'm not trying to sell things to people, and that this whole project is a passion project that's solely supported through people on Patreon. If they want to, support what I'm doing and contribute that way, that's amazing. But like, I see the way that like I've been contacted by brands and seeing the way that like influences my creative ability to do things. And it's like, no, I just want to share these fun facts because I think it's education that everybody deserves to know. Like we have so many barriers to entry from, race and income, like to getting access to these things. It's like, this is the world we all share. We should all be, familiar with these processes and these things that are happening on the lands in which we all share. And I think looking at it in like a bioregional scale, like you mentioned, the Pacific Northwest, like I commonly reference the Cascadian bioregion, which is basically that stretch of forest from like Northern California up through Alaska along the coast, and then the Columbia River Basin. So all the water that flows, from Idaho into the Snake River, like eventually comes out the mouth of the Columbia. So this whole area is connected by these biotic factors that shape the species that live here and the communities that live amongst these lands and waters. So I really try to focus on that sort of stretch of the world just because it's home to me. I was raised in Washington. I lived in Oregon for a bit. I visit California frequently. I currently reside in BC. And it's all connected. That foliar uptake video you're talking about was from a recent video down to the redwoods. And it's like an incredible process. People like talk about like, oh, the redwoods drink trees. It's like, okay, that's a cool statement. But if you don't understand how that happens, you really, you can't really appreciate it unless you understand how it happens. And that's where foliar uptake it's an incredible process.
Ross, I'm so curious, like at what point did it go from, hey, this is kind of a joke that I'm like posting about this stuff, and then, to get really serious and, the uptake of followers and people interested in the content. Where did that shift kind of happen?
That's an interesting question. I can't say that there was like a defining moment. I think it's been very gradual. I think there's been a lot of things happening, on an environmental and kind of broader policy level things up here in Canada. We had what was known as the Fairy Creek blockades back in 2021, which to date are the biggest act of civil disobedience in all of Canadian history. Over 1,000 people were arrested trying to protect this little block of old growth forest from being logged. We tend to think these days that like old growth forest is protected, even in the States, and it's protected, but like it's not. It's still actively being logged, and we're down to the remaining, here in British Columbia, it's less than 2% of the highest productivity old growth forests are remaining, and they're still actively being logged. Across Turtle Island as a whole, it's somewhere between 3 to 5%, although it's loose because of monitoring and how these figures are drawn and everything. But it's something that's still actively happening. So that happened in 2021, and I became like a pretty big voice on the internet for talking about the ecology of old growth forests and why it's important that we protect this diversity and complexity and all the different stuff here. And that served as like a really important role, I think, in educating the public on why this issue is important. And from that, I've been able to see so many amazing things ripple outwards. And I get messages from people sporadically. They're like, I love your account. Like, I quit my job and went back to school for biology because of you. And I'm just like, oh God, like, that's amazing. It's given me such a great fulfillment in life and feeling like I'm actually like making a change and getting people connected to it and loving their lands and doing so in a way that is like pretty progressive when we look at kind of the old colonial models of like forest management, for example, and being able to get people to re-envision things in a different way and then like see how the future can be different, where we can live in reciprocity amongst these lands and not just be this kind of constant take mindset, this growthist mindset that capitalism and that Western expansion has kind of got us into this idea of normalizing. It's not healthy, it's not sustainable, it's not creating a better planet. We're actively witnessing that right now. So how can we do things better and how can we do things differently? It's a really powerful place to be kind of working in right now. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, gosh, your love for the Northwest forest is so clear. It comes through so passionately. Obviously, you heard Vicky and I talking about just being in the forest earlier at the top of the show. For you, what is it about these forests that draws you to them?
Whoa, I don't even know. I mean, if I were to summarize it in one kind of short word, it would be the complexity. I think the complexity is key to these forest ecosystems, and recognizing that every forest is different is such an intriguing thing to me. I think when most people think of a forest, we picture a bunch of trees. I'm like, okay, trees, that's a forest. And we look at on a hillside, like that's a forest. But everybody listening to this now, every one of us that has our experiences growing up in certain parts of the world, like our ideas of a forest are different. Even those trees that you look at from a macro distance on the skyline, like those are different species that have gone through different things, that have weathered different events depending on where in the watershed or relative to the coast that they are, like how storms move through. And then you start working your way down to like the micro side of it, and all the complexity of the different mosses and the understory plants, the species that comprise those soils, the fungi in those soils that connect different species through different mycorrhizal fungi connections, like all this different stuff. It's all totally unique to every forest. So the forest that you guys are in the Willamette Valley, I'm assuming in Portland area, like, amazing, incredible old growth, or not old growth, but Douglas fir forests, ecosystems that have their own specific mix of, dull Oregon grape and salal in the understory, lots of red huckleberry and blueberry. And then you make your way up to where I am on Vancouver Island, and we have it's a coastal western hemlock biogeoclimatic zone, so there's a lot more western red cedar, more hemlock. We don't have Doug firs here on the coast. We have giant Sitka spruce trees down to like all sorts of different species of vaccinium and like evergreen huckleberry and different stuff on the forest floor. And then down to like the redwoods where I was just a couple weeks ago. The redwoods are still in the Cascadian bioregion, but completely different mix of biota there, like completely different tree species to understory species. So I think it's like that curiosity and recognizing that everywhere you go, every forest community is different because of the way that those different biotic forces interact, whether that's the hydrology, how much water it gets, the rate at which water moves through based on the kind of bedrock there, the depth of the soil, the weather, like whether you see freezing cold winters. There's so many different inputs. And I think that is like the most fascinating thing to me is you can go like just over a mountain pass and see a completely different mix of species than on the other side, completely different factors with like rain shadows and everything. So it's just like staying curious about it and just being in this part of the world. There's so much to go on. Like if I could say one more thing, because I recognize I'm going on to a rant. One of the things that I love about the Cascadian bioregion is when you look at the fact that these forests are dominated by conifers. I don't know about you guys, but I grew up on Jurassic Park, the OG 1993 version.
Yep.
Dinosaurs for me was a gateway drug, and like just to loving all things nature. But following the KPG mass extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs, it also wiped out a lot of the conifer dominated forests around the planet. And at that point, angiosperms or deciduous trees kind of were much better at colonizing these areas of disturbance. So angiosperms, deciduous trees, end up kind of taking over the world from like Eastern Turtle Island all across Europe, the Brazil, South America, like all these are like, forests that are dominated by broadleaf trees. But little remnants of the conifer dominated forest still exist around the boreal forest up north where it's too cold for angiosperms to exist. And then along the ring of fire here, the Pacific, the Pacific Rim. So it's like the coast of Turtle Island, like from California up through Alaska, and then across to like the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia, Japan, a little bit there down in Chile, and then like, yeah, it's so like these are kind of like the last remnants of conifer dominated forests on the planet that would have existed when dinosaurs were roaming the earth. And that to me is like just sick.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah. Thinking about just being in the forest, like on a hike and thinking about like, man, what would just imagining a dinosaur be out there? Like there's a spot on the southern coast. I don't know if you've been there, called Prehistoric Gardens. And it is a coastal forest where they have life-size dinosaur statues in the forest.
I was there. Yeah, there's a recent post. I did like some kind of satirical slideshow through there. It's maybe like 4 or 5 posts back. Yeah, it's a great place.
I look at that. Yeah.
Yeah. And wasn't The Lost World filmed around Oregon too somewhere?
Oh, I don't know.
It's the sequel to Jurassic Park.
I got to look that up now.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I mean, so many weird movies were filmed in Oregon. You never know. I mean, it's and BC for that matter.
Yeah, so that the dinosaur fact, that's one of my favorites.
So Ross, you mentioned this a little bit, talking about kind of like your rise on the interwebs. And but obviously, it's been kind of a turbulent moment, to say the least, in the natural world. Like, what would you say the current state of the forests are?
Well, unfortunately, we're at a really defining point in I think humanity moving forward on like a broader ecological scale, but especially within the bioregion. Our forests have faced just incredible devastation as a result of clear cutting tactics that really came about post World War II. Prior to that, you had like horse-drawn logging and selective logging, where people were only limited, or they were limited by the technology and what they were able to take out, because you can only take so much stuff. So it kind of made for a more sustainable way of practicing logging. But after World War II, you have this mechanization of the forest industry, because you have all this tank technology coming over from Europe, and people wanting to try to put this technology to new uses. And this is when you begin to see mass extraction in fisheries, in forests, oil and gas, all sorts of like mass extraction happening from our natural world. And that's when you really start to see clear cuts that just eradicated all that complexity that I mentioned before, all that diversity of these species, both in biological diversity, but genetic diversity of the trees. Fast forward to like the 90s, you start replanting trees from small selected crops based on what's going to perform best. Then you end up with these mass monocultures of forests all throughout Turtle Island, basically, like the United States and Canada, and both have their nuances based on where they are. But then this kind of broad scale action across these landscapes has led to a lot of really devastating trickle down impacts that we're seeing, and again, there's a lot of nuances here, but to speak to like the pine beetle, for example, the pine beetle epidemic was a thing that happened in the Midwest states, like up through Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, into Alberta and BC. But it was basically this pine beetle that normally would have been eradicated by colder winters. Of course, we're seeing not as cold winters because of climate change, but they also really like trees at a certain age and certain types, certain species. And since we had replanted all these forests that we had clear cut with pine monocultures, this whole forest was susceptible to this insect because we lacked that diversity in older trees and younger trees and habitat. It was all just the same. So it wiped out all these forests. And now these forests are primarily the ones in the Midwest that are burning up because there's no more living trees. There's no diversity there. And same here in Washington, Oregon, BC. Like, we're seeing horrible wildfires every summer, but all these wildfires are happening in these younger second growth forests where we've either replanted or they've regenerated naturally prior to the 90s, usually from like hemlock. So you have these really tight, dense stands of trees that wouldn't exist naturally across the landscape size that they are. Fire is a natural part of our forest ecosystems, but fire historically came through in much smaller burns because there was this diversity within this mosaic of trees. So you have older trees that are resilient to fire. You have younger trees which tend to get wiped out, and it clears the understory and helps that forest succeed. But when you, again, get rid of that complexity, you end up with this monoculture of trees that's all actively competing with one another. So there's a lot of ladder fuel. So when fire does come through, instead of just burning the understory, it burns up to the canopy of those trees, climbing those ladder fuels, burns the whole forest, and it just wipes out the whole area in a much larger scale than would have happened naturally. So there's a lot of things that are happening, kind of culminating at this period in history here. With climate change and the way that we've managed our landscapes, it's leading to a lot of, kind of a really scary future that we're setting up for ourselves.
Well, Ross, something that I've been struck by here just in Oregon, I take people out hiking, friends, people who moved here, people who may not be super familiar with the area. And we go out to the forest, we see some trees, and people go, whoa, those are some really big old trees. And they're like, is this the old growth that I've been told about? And I'm like, no, it's not. This is like really like second generation forest that's been definitely logged. But when you go to like actual old growth, of which you said there's not that much left, and a lot of it is harder to access, you see for me, it's like a different forest completely. It's like a really, really different kind of landscape. So like, there's like this dissonance of people, a lot of folks don't understand what an old growth forest is and means. Especially, I feel like there's an issue with like our newer, younger forest is so impressive that it's like, somehow not giving people the chance to fully grasp how impressive the old forest is.
Right. It's this concept known as shifting baseline syndrome, where, we're kind of limited in what we think is normal based on our experiences. So, the people who were living in this part of the world 100 years ago had a radically different perception of the forests around them versus the one we have now. And yeah, it's tough in Oregon because Doug firs are very productive trees, like within 50, 60 years, like they're huge, they're massive trees. But again, when you compare it to the old growth forests that would have existed, like the level of complexity is just nowhere near the same. So how do you get people understanding that and appreciating that, I think is a really difficult feat these days, just because, like you mentioned, so little of it remains. But I do feel like it is that hands-on connection. Like once you go there and you're able to see the stuff and witness it, and a good bit of it, I think, translates fairly well on social media, just in videos. Like you can see like pit and mound topography is a concept in like an old growth forest where you have bigger, older trees falling over naturally as they die out and root wads rip up, and you end up with like a really undulating bit of terrain where there's like nooks and crannies and different species kind of growing in, and it becomes like a much more dense understory. But a lot of the forests we have in the Pacific Northwest, especially the second growth ones, you walk around and it's like fairly easy to walk off trail because it's like all kind of flat. Like that's, because we haven't had that type of complexity forming in the ecosystem that allows the biotic complexities to form. One of the things that I talk about in a lot of the videos is, like with bear habitat up here in BC, we have a ton of bears, but we're really limited in bear habitat because most bears den in these old western red cedars that have flying buttress style bases where the cedar begins its life on a fallen over nurse log. And so it forms these root structures that end up hollowing out over time because that nurse log eventually decays, and it leaves this like amazing cavity for bears to den in. And we've cut down all those old growth trees. And now, because these are second growth forests that are on industrial kind of harvest complexes, like they're planned to be harvested every 50 to 70 years, you now take out that element of like allowing that sort of habitat complexity to form. So it's like just when we again have this sort of blanket mindset on how we should manage our forests, we end up changing them so radically in such a short period of time that we lose that baseline, that connection to what even was existing in the first place. And I think for me, that's where a lot of the education comes into play, is because there's a lot of like really amazing kind of eco-forestry demonstration forests. One down in Oregon, actually, there's one on Vancouver Island where you can see they've worked within a forest ecosystem, an old growth forest, to actively log that forest. So they're still getting timber resources, but they're doing so in a way that preserves the biological and ecological complexity of that forest. So maintaining that forest complexity through closed canopy harvest and recognizing that we can meet different values of our forests beyond just the economic, but to include cultural and recreational and spiritual and all those things that we kind of mentioned at the beginning, that feeling of being able to like rest up amongst a tree. Like that's a universal right for all of us that we should be able to experience. And for one private logging company to clear cut all that to make profits for their shareholders against the will of the stakeholders involved, the people who live on those lands, like that shouldn't be happening. We need to find new ways to re-envision this, to bring more stakeholders into these conversations so that we can find a way to do it better for everybody on the landscape, from human people to non-human people alike.
Well put, Ross. It's like you've practiced this. It's like you've said these things before.
I mean, yeah, I have a bit of experience.
Well, your passion for this is so clear, and that's what I mean. It comes through in your videos so much, and this is one of the reasons I think I love following you, is because I get a little snippet of this knowledge and this passion for that you're sharing with folks. I'm curious to know. So we talked a little bit about this, but what are you hoping that people get out of your videos when you post these online?
I mean, I constantly say, I guess I haven't really said this publicly, but every day with every video I make, I am trying to put myself out of work. Like, I don't want to be an influencer. I hate social media. Like, I don't want to be doing this. Like, I think, this is a service, a role that I think should exist in our society. I think that people should have connection to and love for the outdoor world. we don't have that right now. So like every video that I do, I'm trying to, connect to people to get them to love the world so that we can create a world in which my role doesn't exist. Being over here, hey, remember guys, like these trees create the air we breathe, and they actually solidify the soils that prevent landslides from taking out our highways and our communities and purify our drinking water. And if we have healthy forests, then we don't have to worry about fire evacuations and smoke every summer. Like, I don't want to have to do that. So with every video I do, I'm trying to just kind of like, create a better world, the type of world that I wish to live in the future, which is just where I don't exist doing this. Basically, it's kind of a sad state of affairs in many respects.
Well, Ross, I must ask, what are some of your favorite forests here in the Pacific Northwest?
Ooh, forest, just like specific forest stands, or just like forest types, or
and all of the above. We like to ask people on here, like, because we're ostensibly a travel and outdoors podcast. Like, where do you like to go? What are some of your favorite places to visit? In this region?
Well, again, going back to that complexity kind of thing that I outlined in the past, just a few moments ago, I think it's really great to take a macro look at it and then a micro look at it. Some of my favorite forests, I could easily list like the Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia, or even where I am out in Ucluelet on traditional Ucluelet Nation territory here. There's some amazing little tracts of old growth forest, and up in Cloquet Nation territory, there's amazing forests like the Big Tree Trail. If you ever come out to Tofino on Vancouver Island, gorgeous little bit of forest. And then down in Oregon, there's like all the stuff along the coast, southern coast of Oregon, the redwoods. There's so many like amazing stands where it's like you can go, and like I encourage people to just go to their forest and get lost, because within those stands you have the micro bits, which I find to be like the most tethering to a place. For example, my parents live outside of Gig Harbor, just outside of Tacoma in Washington, and there's a park there. It's just your kind of standard park. It was like a homestead that was dedicated by the family when they passed away, but it was all logged. But there's this one Doug fir on there that twists in this really peculiar way, and it's just this one tree out of this like, landscape where indigenous peoples have lived and stewarded since time immemorial, and settler families have lived there for, I think, like 200 to 300 years, and now it's a public park. But like this one tree is like one of my favorite trees of all time, and I never would have found it if I wasn't just out exploring a park. Just some random piece of forest. So yeah, I think wherever you are is the most amazing forest around. You just have to become familiar with it and become acquainted to it and get to know those trees as individuals. And then you form relationships with them that, last over time. And yeah.
I love that, Ross. That's great. It's reminding me of some of my favorite trees and some of my favorite trails around here. There's this great out in Oxbow Park. There's a big fallen Doug fir that I came across one day, shortly after it had fallen. I've just been watching this fallen tree like change over the last like 7 or 8 years. And it's been so cool to watch this like dead tree like slowly rot and things start to grow on top of it, and the brush growing over it. It's just, yeah, like you said, treating trees as individuals, getting to know them, spending time. I feel like there's such a great value in repeat visits to the same places over and over again. As nice as it is to go to different spots all the time, I love going to the same spot and just seeing it in different seasons over the years, and watching the forest, grow and express itself in these different ways is kind of coming back to the beginning of the episode here. It just being within that is such a joy and a privilege.
It totally is. And I think, becoming present and aware of your surroundings is such an important skill for people to cultivate in these days. And like you said, I mean, to have almost a decade of observation in a single spot, like that's deep relationship with the land, with the place that you can't just get in a quick forest walk. Like it takes that repeat visits. And they say that like the lifetime of a tree is only half of its actual what we would consider to be life. Once it falls and starts to recycle those nutrients in the forest, like that's the whole kind of second stage of its life, and it's giving that forest back. It's that reciprocity to all the other beings in that forest that are going to utilize that. And there's something magical about that. My afternoon after this, I'm going to go record a video that I've had planned. That's kind of like a video about mourning and loss, because there's this cedar on a walk around here just out of town that it was one of my favorite trees of all time. And it was so gorgeous. And it had this Western hemlock, Tsuga heterophylla, growing in it, like epiphytically, hundreds of feet in the air. And you could see this single root from this hemlock growing down into the soil, like following the trunk of this cedar. And it was like one of my favorite trees, but it blew down in a storm like a couple weeks ago. And it's like, it's sad for sure in regards to like this one tree and all of the life that kind of it housed in its canopy and that like used it as home. But in the same sense, it's like that's where this mourning aspect comes in, this aspect of grief. It's like we can grieve, like actively grieve something that we've lost because we have all this unused love for it. But that doesn't mean that that love isn't going other places. And now that that tree's fallen, it's created a gap in the canopy that it's going to allow its own offspring to kind of come up and fill that gap. Those nutrients are going to be slowly recycled as it degrades and decays over hundreds of years. And so it's like, it's punctuated in our short kind of human life cycles as being this like really tragic event where we've lost one tree. But at the same time, that's the nature of life. Change is constant. Change is always happening. And if we can kind of, become more aware of and comfortable with the impermanence of life and like let go of our attachments to things always being the same, as much as I would have loved for this tree to outlive me, this is where we are right now. So it's just kind of finding ways to find peace within our own place within this broader cycle of life on this planet.
It's beautiful, beautifully put in a great way to wrap things up here. So Ross, thank you so much again for being here. If folks want to find you, find your videos, learn more about what you have to teach us, what is the best way for folks to find you?
Nerdy About Nature on Instagram, TikTok, all the kind of social medias. I have a Facebook too, but I don't post there too regularly because, it's Facebook. Nerdyaboutnature.com is a great way to just get all of it. I have an email blast there. And then again, I have like a Patreon thing. And I also have a podcast, which I failed to mention. But I do like kind of long form sit down interviews with people out in nature, specialists in different fields. And that's just Nerdy About Nature as well. So if you just do a quick Google, you'll find all the channels.
Perfect. Well, Ross, thank you so much again for coming on to talk with us today. It was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me on. It's been an absolute treat getting myself mentally into the forest with you guys. It's been great.
Well, folks, that will wrap things up for us for today. Until next time, you can watch our videos on the Oregonians YouTube channel and view all of our travel and outdoors coverage on OregonLive.com/travel, as well as HereIsOregon.com.
Please leave us a rating or review if you enjoyed the show. And if you want to support this podcast as well as our local journalism, please consider a subscription to Oregon Live. You can find details at OregonLive.com/pod support. Also, if you're a fan of the show and you're interested in potentially sponsoring it, you can get in touch with our marketing people at advertise@Oregonian.com. This episode of the show is produced by me, Vicki Connor, alongside Jamie Hale.
Stay safe and happy travels, everyone. Until next time, we leave you at this 10 seconds of Zen.